We are pleased to welcome our presenter for today, Patrick Kluver. Patrick has a wealth of experience in endemic and exotic disease control. This includes carrying out research into Johne's disease for the Victorian Government and MLA, and working as a lecturer at the University of Melbourne Veterinary School for 5 years. This webinar is live and interactive. You are encouraged to participate by posting questions to the presenter, which can be typed into the chat box located at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. All questions will be answered throughout and at the end of the webinar. If you are experiencing difficulty hearing the sound during the webinar, please dial the 1-800 support number listed in the chat box. I'd now like to pass you over to Patrick to begin.
Thanks, Shona. Thanks, everybody, for taking up your valuable time today. So today is going to talk about JD and beef cattle, and I'll emphasise that I am talking about beef cattle, and of course dairy cattle is one of the main diseases, the main species we see this disease in. So today I'm going to talk about a little bit overview of the disease. So what actually is Johne's disease? What sort of impact might it have on farm? I'm just going to go through the Johne's disease review, which occurred last year, and which led us to the current situation, which is the development of the current tools, including the beef assurance score. So let's just do a bit of revision or learn a little bit about Johne's disease. So Johne's disease is caused by a bacteria. It's a mycobacteria. Mycobacterium avium subspecies paratuberculosis. And this is a disease which is basically spread to fecal oral route. So usually infected cattle, usually of an older age, shedding the bacteria in their gut on the feces, contaminating pasture or contaminating water. Now, calves pick up this through either feeding or grazing, but calves can also be infected in utero, more rarely, or infected through the milk. Most commonly, as far as that route goes, is probably fecal contamination of the udder itself. But in general, that's the way animals become infected, is that fecal oral route. Now, in cattle, we see quite a specific age-related immunity. So cattle are much more susceptible in that first year of growth and than other times. So it's much easier to infect a young animal than to infect an old animal. The progression of the disease is a little bit dependent upon the age of infection, but also the level of contamination and infection when they're first infected. So animals which get a large dose will break down earlier than animals which get a low dose. So that's going to be affected by climate, going to be affected by stocking rate, and number of clinical animals you have on the place. The disease itself, is one of the things we've got to remember with bovine Johne's disease or Johne's disease in cattle is that herds can be infected for many years before you see any signs. So when we looked at how long it was to detect disease when animals came into a herd, it was an average of about 3 to 4 years beforehand. But a third of index cases, that's the first case on farm, were homebred, meaning that some animal in the past has come in and being subclinically infected and infected either another animal which was subclinically infected or infected your index case. So it makes it a very difficult disease to regulate in such. So the regulation of this disease is difficult because a lot of the time people are trading without knowing they're infected. The disease itself, although animals are infected as calves, the average age of infection for animals across cows and bulls is about 5.7 years. And this varies between 1.5, which is extremely unusual, to older animals at 13.5 years. And of course, a lot of animals go to slaughter, which are subclinically infected, which show no clinical signs at all. So, and unfortunately, unlike sheep, which we have an ability to detect the disease quite well at abattoirs, we don't have that ability of beef cattle. The clinical signs themselves are scouring and wasted, basically. So these animals remain bright and alert. They have an unresponsive to treatment diarrhea, so they usually have a diarrhea which is caused by a malabsorption of nutrients in the terminal small intestine, and this leads to a wasting, a leaking of protein, and the animals remain bright and alert. Now, cattle vets who work with this disease all the time tell me you can tell what the scouring on the Johne's disease infected animal because it's got little bubbles in it. But anyway, so any animal which has got, an older animal which has got scouring, wasting, could be suspected as being Johne's disease. I'm going to talk a little bit about the strain specificity, which is one of the things which has really led to the development of this new regime we're talking about. For a long time, we actually believed that the strain BJD was mostly caused by a bovine strain of Johne's disease, Mycobacteria paratuberculosis. Ovine Johne's disease in sheep was caused by the sheep strain. And the feeling was that occasionally you would get crossover, but it was a rare event rather than a common event. As we've learnt more about the disease, and one of the things about this disease is that detecting whether the herd's infected or not by judging on whether animals are breaking down for disease is a very insensitive way of doing it. So over years, we now see that across Australia, about 14% of beef cattle which have broken down with Johne's disease have the ovine strain in them. In areas with a high level of ovine OJD, like Western Districts of Victoria, the Johne's disease in cattle there, about half the cases are caused by the cattle strain, and about half the cases are caused by ovine strain. In New Zealand, a survey done a couple of years ago in beef cattle showed that the JD in beef cattle was mostly caused by the ovine strain, or what we call the ovine strain. They call it something different. So the story is quite different in the dairy industry because there's a lot less crossover between sheep and cattle, of course. But so certainly the original assumptions of some of the control programs we put in place, or some of the assumptions we based our rules on for Johne's disease, well, that's subsequently found to be not incorrect. So Johne's disease, sheep strain of ovine Johne's disease, seems to readily pass into cattle. So one of the things we discovered when we looked at the beef cattle which had been infected, we did some retrospective studies of all the beef cattle, is that bulls look like they're a high risk for introducing Johne's disease. Now this is of course you'd think it would be a natural assumption. A lot of herds, the only important animals they bring in are bulls, so of course the first case is going to be most likely to be an imported animal, most likely to be a bull. But it looks like bulls are actually a little more susceptible to disease. So bulls tend to break down at a younger age than the cow. So average of 4.3 years versus 6.3 years for a cow. Exactly why this is, it's not entirely sure, but certainly there was no difference between bulls breaking down which are homebred versus imported bulls. So it does appear that bulls are a high risk. So certainly when you're thinking about controlling disease, and certainly if you're purchasing bulls, it's one of the things you've got to consider is what is their Johne's disease status. So there's a lot of conjecture, a lot of talk about the economics and how important this disease is. Now, I'm going to show you two slides which I think will sort of sums up the importance of disease as far as direct losses on farm. Now, there's two losses we used to encourage you to Johne's disease, and they were direct and indirect losses. Direct losses were the losses due directly to disease, through animals scouring and dying, and of course the indirect losses are the losses imparted by regulation. So quarantine, unable to sell seed stock if you were previously a producer, etc., etc. So the first slide is showing you the net present value with a 10% discount on stock prices. This was work was done by John Webber and the McKinnon Project in the University of Melbourne. And John's mapped out a 10-year forward forecast looking at 10% discount depending on what you do, what control program you put in place on your infected property, whether it be base, test and cull, partial destock or total destock. So, and John's conclusion from this was that it was not worth contemplating control programs on farm for a beef property unless you actually had at least 5% annual losses. Now, 5% annual losses, we're talking about 10 cows in a 200 cow breeder property. So that's quite an extreme level. in a sort of 200 cow herd, we might be looking, if endemically infected Johne's disease, we might expect to see one animal every couple of years, or one animal, more likely one animal every 4 to 5 years, breaking down Johne's disease. So in most circumstances, a tested control program or a culling program or destocking program will lose you money compared to actually living with the disease. Now, this is not to say that in some circumstances where we have beef cattle run in high stocking rates in particular breeds, possibly in high rainfall areas, we don't eventually see some losses. But in the majority of cases, we don't. We see very few losses. So the other bit of information which I'll show you today is the actual overall cost to industry of Johne's disease compared to other conditions, whether they be parasitic conditions, production conditions, or infectious diseases. And as you can see, there's the big guns like Caltech, $160 million, BVD, $110 million, internal parasites around $90 million, and we compare that to bovine Johne's disease, which in the beef industry across the whole country costs about $1.4 million direct losses. So this was put together to actually help. One of the reasons it's put together is MLA. It helps them make them decide on where they're going to put their research dollars. So if you're looking at that, it certainly is a disease which is probably at one end of the scale compared to the more important diseases we see in the country. So on perspective with that, a lot of the cost of disease, you could say that in some circumstances the cost of regulation was actually more than the actual cost of disease. And look, that is open to debate, but I think that that clearly that as far as like a direct losses and on-farm production losses, in most circumstances, Johne's disease is not as serious as other diseases. The other thing which is attached to this disease, and which is attached to a lot of disease which we have regulation involved with, is the stigma attached to it. And that particularly in cattle, it's Johne's disease has got a stigma attached to it. I think that in Victoria, certainly, and I'm not speaking for other states here, but in Victoria, once ovine Johne's disease was deregulated, a lot of the stigma attached to that disease was removed over time, and the actual disease was treated as any other production disease that if it required treatment and required preventative vaccination was put in place, etc., etc. So this guy here is obviously taken hold of and gained ownership of that JD name and trying to destigmatise himself. But I think we'll find over the years that as we remove regulation, we tend to remove the stigma associated with disease as well. The tests. This is one of the other reasons this disease is not necessarily lends itself to regulation, is that the tests we have for the disease basically share one thing in common. They are unreliable in young animals. So testing of young animals coming onto farm or moving between states is an unreliable means of actually reducing. In fact, the test approaches zero as ability to detect animals, very young animals. So in some of the tests, when you're testing 2-year-old animals which replacing heifers, etc., the test doesn't work very well. What the tests are good at, though, is they're very reliable in clinical cases. So as the disease progresses and you get more and more levels of bacteria in the animal, you might have clinical signs of scouring. All the tests work pretty well in actually detecting those things, and they're as good as any other test. They're just not very good at detecting subclinically infected animals. Other thing that tests are good at is use as herd tests. So we have used them previously as for testing whole herds or testing part herds to try and give us some assurance or increase assurance that herd may be free of disease. So in that situation, we test entire herds with what's called a sample test or a sample, and that gives us some assurance that the herd may be free of disease. We get increased insurance the more we test. So repeated testing on a single herd increases our assurance that the herd may be of low risk. We never say free because we can never guarantee a herd's free of disease. The other thing which we widely use in the sheep industry, of course, is the vaccination for Johne's disease. Now, the Silaram vaccine, which is registered for cattle, is a very good vaccine, like the Good Air vaccine in sheep. It reduces clinical cases to the point where they become no longer a problem. So in most circumstances, it's very reliable at doing that. One of the things it's not good at, of course, it's not a sterilising vaccine, and the fact that it does not eliminate disease. So you still can spread disease from infected properties if they've been vaccinated. So important to remember that. The other thing to remember is that it's as far as economics goes, in most circumstances, it's not an economic proposition to use this in beef herds. A very different equation when you're talking about dairy herds with higher individual value of animals, but also higher individual production value per year of animals. It's a very different proposition. So in most beef herds, even if they're infected, will probably not require vaccination, or will not be economical to justify vaccination. Again, there are herds which have quite heavy losses and quite infected, and in that situation, the vaccine works very well in reducing cases. The other thing about the vaccine is it's required to permanently identify animals which have been vaccinated, so that they don't end up in overseas markets of live export, because what happens with this is there is some interference with some of the tests for Johne's disease, but also some of the tests for tuberculosis, which also is a mycobacterial disease. So you may get reactors in a tuberculosis test overseas, and certainly the cattle industry doesn't want that to happen. So the National BJD review. So in summary, what we've got with BJD is we have a disease which is not necessarily easy to regulate because of the nature of the disease itself and the fact that it can be with infected herds for a long time before anybody notices it's there. The fact that the tests are not reliable in young animals, and the fact that the actual regulation, the cost of the disease itself is not high. So the actually economic direct losses are far less than the actual costs due to the indirect losses through the regulation of the disease in previous. So the National BJD review was concluded last year, and it was brought forward for the simple reason that a couple of these things happened. The incident in Queensland in 2012-2013, where a prominent stud broke down and resulting in probably infected for quite a long time before it was known to be infected, resulted in a high number of traces, and resulting in very few infected animals found from that, but it resulted in the interruption of trade for a large number of properties for a certain period of time. So certainly cost some trace-forward properties a lot of money as far as losing trade goes. Other thing which we discussed earlier, which became quite clear, is the different JD strains in cattle were being treated differently, and we were seeing increasing numbers of sheep strains infected in cattle. And so, previously, if a market assurance program herd broke down with disease and it was shown to be ovine strain, the previous national standard definitions of rules, that didn't affect the market assurance program status because it wasn't bovine strain. And the other thing which is occurring too was the decreasing numbers of herds within the cattle map. And this is a graph showing you how many what's happened to the cattle map properties. And from a high of 1,600 properties in the early this century to less than 400 in 2016, it was becoming quite obvious that there was less value seen in the cattle market assurance program. So it was reviewed as well, and the review concluded that it was meeting its technical goals of providing low-risk animals for JD, for cattle to market. The numbers had fallen dramatically and basically to unsustainable levels, because you need a certain core or certain number of herds, because those herds, because of their market assurance program status, have to be able to trade with it amongst each other. So once you get to low levels where you can't buy animals, except animals of a lower status, then the actual program becomes unsustainable. The participants themselves were concerned that the benefits being it were not not outweigh the risk, and there are some risks involved in doing this test, and some of them include being found to be positive or found to be true positive, but also when tests gave false positives and they had to be sorted out, individual sales would be lost, or actual on-farm sales would have to be deferred, meaning a financial disaster to a lot of people who really are buying bulls or buying replacement on a just-in-time sort of basis. So there's some prominent cases where ELISA positives had to be clarified, and they weren't clarified quick enough to actually stop sales. So the current format arrangements was concluded were no longer suitable. So the cattle map, so all this information went back to the BJD steering committee. So, and the conclusions were for that that there should be a mechanism in place that people can demonstrate high levels of JD assurance, and that the cattle map would be discontinued with an alternative voluntary assurance scheme. And I put on the highlighted the term voluntary. It was introduced from 1st of November 2016. So the new cattle approach to JD. JD is included, looked upon as, rather than individual disease, looked upon as a broader biosecurity approach. So it was property-centric rather than based on zones. So looking at what happened on a property rather than looking at what's happening in a whole state as a whole, or looking at what the history of other areas. So removal of zones, so the previous zoning has now been removed. So areas where it was where you required certain statuses to go are now largely being removed on the East Coast. South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland can now trade freely without actual state regulations involved. And states to remove regulation, except the notification requirement. And this is the notification requirement is that in all states, Young's disease remains a notifiable disease, meaning you can't, if you suspect Young's disease on your property, you must report it to the authorities or report it to a veterinarian. If a veterinarian suspects Young's disease, they must report it. This is one, so we can keep track of infected properties, but two, to fulfill the requirements for international reporting requirements for the OIE, the World Health Organization of Animals, which requires us to actually report the number of cases of Young's disease we have every year on a yearly basis. And also sensibly that all strains considered JD in cattle. So whether you have ovine strain or bovine strain or the strain which was in Queensland, which was the what was called the bison strain, that they all just be considered Young's disease, and that we shouldn't differentiate them or think that they're not one or the other. So there's also the ability to work cooperatively. So there is the ability for producers in segments of the market or small geographical areas to actually form cooperative biosecurity areas to try and avoid disease. So this is developed into a whole suite of tools, which include things like the Young's disease biosecurity test list, JBAS, the Young's disease beef assurance score, National Farm Biosecurity Reference Manual, and the National Cattle Health Declaration. Let's just go through them. So National Cattle Declaration has been updated. It used to be called the National Cattle Health Statement. Now it's called the Declaration, so it implies its importance. And it has a section on Young's disease where you put your JBAS score in there. The Market Assurance Program, the National Farm Biosecurity Reference Manual, which will help people develop biosecurity plans. So let's just go through what the actual JBAS system is. So it's a point scoring system. It's equivalent to what exists in the dairy industry and the dairy score. The higher the points, the higher assurance you'll get. So we start off at 0 for either unknown, infected or suspect herds, and we progress up to 8, which is the highest assurance you can get. Now currently, in the interim arrangements that exist till the end of this month, most former market assurance program herds will be level 8. If you're in any of the protected zones or you're a beef-owning herd in Victoria or Tasmania, you'll currently be given an interim score of 7. And then there's all the other herds that might be infected will be 0. So at the end of this financial year, those herds which don't have a biosecurity plan in place will drop down to 0. The idea of this is to make sure that people who are doing nothing about the disease or nothing to control the disease don't get a free ride because they're actually not doing anything. Now, herds which are infected will still have to declare that they are infected on the actual when they're selling cattle. So we don't want people hiding the fact that they're infected. So very important to ask people if they come from the cattle you're buying come from the only infected property, and in some situations that will not make any difference to what you're doing, what your business is doing. So I suppose the question is, where do you want to be and how do you want to stay there? Let's just go through and talk a little bit about what's going to happen. So one of the things which is important to remember is I said before that the zoning had been removed, but there is requirements to move interstate put on by Government of Western Australia and Government of NT at the request of their industry bodies. They want to maintain some sort of restriction on movement into those states. So currently, in Northern Territory is nominally a JBAS 7 score. That will drop down to JBAS 6 in following the 1st of July. WA it requires somewhat of a higher assurance, and the WA requirements are going to depend on what state you're coming from. So if that's a market that interests you, make sure you check out the JBAS, the requirements to move into the it's called the LB1 form, and it's on the DAFA website. And really, it's probably equivalent to Market Assurance Program 3 or something around that. But it really does depend on whether you come from Northern Territory or Queensland, or whether you come from Victoria or Tasmania. So have a look at that if that's a market that interests you. So what happens if I don't do anything on 1st of July? I drop back to 0. Now that might have anything to do with your business at all. That might be exactly what you wanted to do. If I want to maintain my score at 7, I'm going to have to get involved with a veterinary advisor to have a look at put a biosecurity plan in place, and then I'm going to have to do a check test, which is a test of 50 animals every 3 years. If I am currently a market insurance program and I've got a score of 8 currently, and I want to maintain that, I have to maintain a relationship with the veterinarian, and I have to do a triennial check test at the end of 50 animals. If I decide that I don't think it's worthwhile doing that, and I don't want to drop down to 0, and I'm currently in the protected area, I've got a score of 7, I want to maintain a score of 6, I have to put a biosecurity plan in place, and then make sure I comply with the actual Yoni disease requirements of the Yoni biosecurity plan as well. So that might be a position which some people want to do, and it gives you flexibility to move up if you think that might be a requirement in the future. If you are at 6 and you want to move up to a 7, you have to do a sample test, which is a test of the whole herd. Now, remember, if you're doing testing, there is some considerable cost in doing some of this testing, and you may be looking at a couple of $1,000s to do these testing for these various different levels. So a lot of herds, some people may not think it's worthwhile doing, so they may decide to stay at 6, keep their options open to do it. Some people may not think it's worthwhile doing, so they may decide to stay at 6, keep their options open to do it. Theoretically, if you drop down to 0, you have to have a biosecurity plan in place for 5 years before you get it back up to that 6th level. And there is a pathway for people who are infected or suspect to make their way back up there too, by initially removing clinical cases, removing at-risk animals, and making sure that they've got a biosecurity plan in place and no history of disease. Right. So the complementary tools, I suppose I want to talk about, first I'm going to talk about what is a biosecurity plan, and there's a lot of conjecture about this. The biosecurity plan basically is a plan which outlines what you do on your place to do a number of things in broad, holistic terms. One, to make sure that you minimise risk of importing disease and that may be a number of diseases on your property, but also making sure you minimise the risk of spreading disease. So, most of us don't deliberately spread disease, but we may inadvertently spread disease by sending animals which may be from a infected property into the sale yard, intending them for slaughter, but someone else buys them. So those two things, making disease doesn't spread inwards or outwards from your property, or at least minimising the risk of that happening. The other thing we want to do is make sure that this is contribute to the early detection of significant diseases, maybe an exotic disease, and so that we can enhance response and get onto these diseases quite quickly, minimise trade restrictions and public health impacts if necessary. So the biosecurity plan reflects those requirements there. It has a number of components, and they're under these headings. Now, there's a number of different biosecurity plans in place, but you can write your own, basically, if they fulfil these requirements. There's the number of two. If you want to look at the biosecurity plans in place, the AHA website will describe them to me. So there's also the cattle vets have one too. It's called BioCheck, which it's proprietary software developed by them. There's also that test. There's LBN have a biosecurity plan, and there's also the farm biosecurity manual as well. But basically, under these headings, you have to actually write out what you're going to do on your property. There's the inputs, which are livestock, feed and water, how you handle the risk involved with the importation of livestock, and always remember that this has a large amount of components, but by far the greatest risk of bringing disease in, of course, is livestock. Most diseases arrive on the back of a truck, but also they can arrive in other things as well. So that's why we have components looking at people, vehicles and equipment that come on, and we're not just worried about disease here, and worried about the spread of weeds as well, and of course people, visitors on the farm, identifying who the high risk ones are, and they will be people who regularly visit other farms and before they come on your farm. So maybe stock agents, maybe veterinarians who are particularly high risk because they're actually looking at sick animals too. Reduction practices on farm, which you do to employ to maintain healthy stock, how you manage pests and weeds, and how you manage preventing them coming in, but also preventing them going out. So how you manage weeds on the place so that you're not affecting neighbours, and how you reduce the chance of the weeds coming onto your place, either with vehicles, animals, etc. The outgoing products, making sure you have the correct, and this is all part of LPA too, outgoing products, making sure you're not spreading disease through the sale of animals, or making sure the animals are within correct withholding periods, etc. And then the documentation and record keeping, where the records are kept, what records you're keeping about the animals, what treatments you're doing, etc., etc. And then for the JBAS score, there's optional Johne's disease-specific activities as well. And I'll go through them now quickly about what they involve. So the JD-specific practices of cattle, include these components. Incoming cattle, are they of similar risk? So are they maybe equivalent JBAS score, or are they young animals, or can you treat them in a way that they won't actually put the main herd at risk? So for this, you should use the JD checklist, which will outline the questions you should ask people you're buying animals of. And of course, you should also check and ask for a cattle health declaration as well. There is an obligation to investigate and report any suspect cases. So if you suspect or suspect Johne's disease, that you're obliged to actually get a veterinary investigation of them to clarify whether they are Johne's disease. So minimise the risk on property of property spread. So that may be how you run your livestock. You may be next to a dairy farm which has a hospital paddock which is slightly uphill from one of your paddocks. You may want to manage that property, that part of the property, by not grazing young septal stock on there. Looking at the risks posed by the species, sheep and goats, both, if infected Johne's disease, pose a risk, and that can be managed. Vaccination would be a suitable management for sheep, or making sure that there's no cross co-grazing with cattle, or especially young cattle. If you do become infected, it's important that you notify people you've sold animals with, the high-risk trades. They can put in place any requirements to actually remove those animals. For JBAS 7 and 8, veterinary oversight is required, so you need to employ a veterinarian. And I would implore people who are from the southern states who are using previously market assurance program vets are probably the vets who you want to use. In states from Queensland and New South Wales, Queensland and Western Australia, where there aren't many market assurance program vets, that's certainly an experienced cattle vet is the person you want to look for. And of course, the requirement for testing every 3 years with a check test, or if you want to progress from a 6 to a 7 or a 7 to an 8, you do your sample testing as well. So really quite simple. So I suppose the question is, what do I do now? What do I do on my place to sort my problem out? I'm not sure I want a JBAS score. So the first question you've got to ask yourself, does a high JBAS score offer any advantage to me? Now that question may be quite easy to answer, it might be a little more difficult to answer. If you're trading into Northern Territory and regularly, and you need that market open for you, then the answer is obviously very easy to answer. It's yes, you must have it put in JBAS 6 score before the June 30. You must write a biosecurity plan. Is there an advantage to me by being score 7? And that for a lot of people who trade or commercial herds, there's probably going to be very little in the way of advantage in that situation for southern states. For feedstock producers, your client, you maybe want to maximise your market, so you may want to maximise your requirements for trading. So you may think about doing a 6. A lot of people are going to think about what score they want to be. They might put in a 6 for the interim and see how the market turns out, and that gives them the option of going into 7 or 8, or 7 at least, requiring testing to get there, or they might want to just maintain a 7 as it is and just go for a cranial test. If you stay at a 6, you're going to have to do a sample test to get into 7. If you want to remain at 7, as you are at 7 at the moment, you're going to employ a vet, put a biosecurity plan with oversight from a veterinarian, and then you're going to do every testing every 3 years. So all those things come at a cost. So whether the actual work of doing such a thing is going to give you a return for your money is a question you have to answer for your individual property. As I said, in a lot of people aren't going to require to do anything about this, but I should emphasise that everyone try to downplay the production issues with this disease, but it is a disease. If you don't have it now, you don't want to have it. You don't want to bring it in. So certainly taking normal procedures, making sure you're looking at cattle health declaration, looking at what previous history of owning disease before you buy animals is a sensible precaution. If you're only buying bulls, you might want to look for a higher JBAS score. You might want to look for a higher assurance that these animals are going to be a low risk to my herd. So I'm going to wind it up there, and we've got a few. Oh, the other thing I've got to mention, the advertising for people in Victoria, and look, we're running these in Victoria, and of course, if you're interstate and you want to travel here for these dates, then I'm very happy to entertain you. We've got limited numbers for them. Now, these have been run in conjunction with the LH, Livestock Health and Biosecurity Victoria, which are part of VFF, the Victorian Farmers Federation. Catherine and Kimberley joint co-conspirators in these workshops. So they're day-long workshops. They run from about 9 till 3. You'll come out at the end of a biosecurity plan, or almost a complete biosecurity plan. There's a nominal cost of $50, which will be just cover your catering, printing materials, and hire the halls. But limited numbers. You go to that. Look, we're going to send this these slides around, so you can click on that and register there. All right. So there seems to be a lot of questions. So I'll try and answer. We've only got a few minutes left, I realise. And the question, look, there's a whole range of questions here. And what I'll do is I will endeavour to answer them and send them all around to all the participants in an anonymous fashion. so that all these things. So some of them are very similar. So a question from Hayden here. Hayden says, who do I have to send if I want to maintain a JBAS 6? Who do I have to send my plan to? Hayden, this is something you maintain yourself. So there's currently there's no requirement to register it anywhere. And what the idea of it would be to make it available if you're selling animals, or people make it available to people who are wanting to look at it. I would assume vaccination would be valuable for stud animals. Now that's a question each individual stud is going to have to answer. One of the things, the vaccine itself does not protect against contracting the disease, it stops expression of disease. So the other thing about the vaccine, it actually reacts quite large site reactions to, and it makes the testing of the disease a little bit more difficult as well. So there are pros and cons of vaccinating valuable stud animals. And certainly these animals still do excrete bacteria. They excrete less bacteria, so they can still excrete bacteria when they come on the float. Is there an audit to show people have a biosecurity plan in place? Currently there is no auditing system, no auditing available. A lot of questions about vaccination. Let's just see. The slides will be made available, will be sent around to all the participants, and your invitation would have made the slides available too, but we will send them around, and the presentation itself will be available online. Question about genetic material, embryos and semen, and it just says genetic material, embryos and semen. Yanis disease itself, it is theoretically possible to spread Yanis disease. So Yanis disease in clinical animals, you can culture it from semen, but animals in licensed semen collection stations are usually tested for Yanis disease. So embryos and semen, although theoretically a risk if they're treated in a normal manner, will be a very low risk, and it's certainly a way of preserving genetic material. Okay, can the disease be caught at sale yards or cartage contractors? How do you protect against this? Certainly theoretically you can pick it. So it's a fecal oral thing. If a truck has transported a clinical animal before you put your animal on the back of it, when that young animal's a young calf or something like that, certainly there is a chance of actually getting infected like that. If you're worried about Yanis disease or any disease, your livestock contractor should be providing a clean, reasonably disease-free, reasonably clean truck to transport on, and the same with sale yards. Sale yards are all these diseases that there is a potential risk. It depends on the age of the animal and whether they have clinical animals in them or not. We do sell animals, so we are located in Central Queensland and do sell animals into NT for live export. Would we need to maintain a level 8 or level 7 qualify? Level 6 should qualify. Natalie E, if you are a level 7, so and that will drop back to 0 on July 1st. So you need to put a biosecurity plan in place to maintain level 6. And so Northern Territory from July 1st will require JBAS 6 for imported animals. All right. If you buy a second-hand trailer or truck or transport, how do you clean it to guarantee status? Look, the bacteria itself, the mycobacteria itself, is quite resistant to a lot of chemicals, but certainly physically cleaning it first, so cleaning it to remove any remnants of organic matter, and then a suitable disinfectant, and allowing it to dry, in most circumstances, would remove the majority of risk associated with previously used stock trailers. genetic material not impacted? Yes, I think you've answered that question. Does vaccinating sheep for OJD assist the protection of cattle run on the same property? Sandra L. Sandra, yes. I think the cases we see of ovine yellow disease or sheep strains in the cattle spillover is usually associated with quite heavy levels of infection. And remember that in sheep we did get, before vaccination, we did get quite high levels of mortality here, so we had large numbers of sheep spreading large numbers of bacteria. So the vaccinating for OJD reduces the output of bacteria, reduces the clinical cases, and then would offer some protection for that disease spilling over into cattle. So if you have infected animals on the place and you want to protect your cattle, think about where they're grazing, think about where the young cattle are grazing, and certainly in most circumstances, vaccinating for OJD, if you presently have it, is the sensible approach. All right. Okay, look, I think we've said we'd wind up around 1:45. There are quite a few questions I haven't got to. So what we'll attempt to do what I'll endeavour to do, what I will do is to actually get a copy of these questions. I'll distribute these questions not anonymously, but I'll take the names of the people who asked them and distribute the answers to all the participants today. So I hope that was informative, and I hope you found that worthwhile. Certainly, as far as any tools go, Animal Health Australia website will assist you with the JD checklist, the farm biosecurity planning guide, and the supplementary questions for the farm biosecurity, your planning, your farm biosecurity plan. Okay. So there's just a post-webinar survey, so if you could just take a few minutes just to fill that out, and we'll send two things around: the answer to the list of questions, and also the copy of the survey. We've got this recorded, so if you wanted to listen to it again, or you want to put someone onto it, we'll also put that up on the LBN website as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick, for your presentation, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. Once again, please stay logged in to take our online survey, which is now on your screen. We thank you in advance for your feedback and wish you a great afternoon.